As it is my pleasure to invite at this time to speak to us the Reverend Dr. Joel Edwards, who is a Jamaican by birth, but he now resides in London, England. Reverend Edwards.
Thank you very much. Well, Honourable Carmen Stewart, whom I have just met for the very first time, but immediately felt I wanted to adopt you as my new mother. To dignitary and colleagues and friends in ministry and many friends who are perhaps just as surprised to see me here tonight as I was almost as surprised to see you, but whose acquaintance I'm very happy to renew. To friends rediscovered and those yet to be discovered, it's my huge privilege and honor to be able to be here. You've just heard that I was born here in Kingston, Jamaica. I left a long time ago at the age of 8 in 1960, and you can do the maths if you want to do that. But let me tell you that every time I come back, I feel very much as though I am somewhat at home. It's not just because I prefer the weather. I think there is something very spiritual and very meaningful and very deep which is taking place. It was my privilege and pleasure to have been linked in with the Diaspora Conference, which concluded after 2 days yesterday. And I think I want to thank the people of Jamaica for the transition which has taken place in your response to the diaspora over recent years. Let me tell you that one of the greatest culture shocks in my life was when I returned to Jamaica from the UK at the age of 27, and having convinced myself for some 20 years or so that I was quite Jamaican, although living in England, I was quite shocked when I came back at the age of 27 and my wife and I were walking down the streets of Kingston to hear people shouting at me and saying, "You come from foreign," which is quite a shock to my system. And that was my appellation for a number of years coming back. But last Saturday night, as I came through passport control, a young man looked at my immigration papers and saw that I had identified myself as a British subject, but that I had also been born in Jamaica. And he looked up at me and he said, "So what brings you back home, sir?" And I thought that was rather nice and very touching and very real and very symbolic of the journey we are making together as the people resident in Jamaica and those of us in the diaspora for whom you are keeping our seats warm till eventually we return. Well, now, it's also a huge pleasure to be here and to identify myself with this conversation about the heartbeat of Jamaica. I think that's how I see what Yvonne is leading us to participate in, and I think it's what I read when I read the book. Let me just say that some things said may or may not be true. If you say the sky is blue, it may be true if you are in Jamaica or Miami. It may not be true if you're in London. But some things said are either true or they're not. There is absolutely no in between those two possibilities. So it's either true or it is not true that every single person made on the planet is made in the image and likeness of God. If that is true, it demands certain things from us. If it is not true, we are at liberty to ignore certain things which God expects from us. There's absolutely no in-between. There are no shades of gray between those two possibilities. And it is either true that God is sovereign of all the earth and of all nations, or he is not. There is no in between. There is no shade of gray in those two positions. And if it is true that God is sovereign over all nations, then we have to ask, what does he expect from people in all nations, at all times, in all geographical locations? And if it's not true, then how might we then devise and organize our life, our domestic arrangements, our politics, our commerce and industry? And this is the most significant question facing humankind as we stand in the vestibule of the 21st century. Up till about 200 years ago, it was generally accepted across Europe, across the Caribbean and the Americas, across the known Western world, that it was indeed true that God had made every single person in his own likeness and after his own image. And that was something which everybody signed up to. Up till 200 years ago, it was fairly well established that God was the sovereign over all nations, and therefore directed and dictated and guided the affairs of all people, our commerce, our industry, our domestic arrangements, our politics, our nationhood. Well, the great experiment began some 200 or more years ago. Some people call it the Enlightenment. And what began to occur to us through a number of thinkers was that probably it is no longer true that we are made in God's image, and possibly therefore it is no longer true that men and women owe their national identities to God, and therefore if we were free from God, we were then at liberty to devise by our own intellectual and philosophical constructions the way our nation should be ran. And so we owe a tremendous amount of fresh thinking from some very intellectual and very intelligent people. Well, it's okay. If it is true that God no longer runs the affairs of nations, then the best we have to guide our politics, the best we have to guide our commerce and industry, the best way we shape a nation is after our own likeness, if we are no longer made in the likeness and image of God. This was the gift of the Enlightenment to us. And it told us, therefore, that true freedom is liberty from whatever God asks of us. It suggested to us that we could, by our own intellectual prowess, our own intellectual energy, our own integrity, our own knowledge, our own terms of reference, we could deploy in order to decide what kind of a nation we might want to be. And so some great thinkers told us that freedom means the ability to determine our own future. Some folks told us that freedom meant the ability to cut ourselves off from the past, so that freedom, political and social and moral freedom, meant the ability for us to decide in the here and now what we felt was right for us in the here and now. We didn't even owe anything to our parents or our forefathers or those before them. We owe nothing to God, we owe nothing to the Bible, we owe nothing to the concept of a revelation which has come down to us from God, and by which, through the Bible and the scriptures and the revelation of Jesus Christ, we must now define who we are as people or even as a nation state. It is, ladies and gentlemen, one of the most pressing and urgent dialogues of human history. Whether or not, in fact, we owe our existence to God, or whether we have now been cut loose to determine our future by our own wisdom and through our own devices.